This week, to be closer to China, it's China's 2019 political season. The annual meetings of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, CPPCC, and the National People's Congress, NPC. Given the complex international environment, including trade and tech tensions, China's rise could encounter great challenges.
I think that we need to recognize no one wins in a trade war. Trade is a win-win for both countries.
Right.
And my only hope is that economic rationality will prevail.
From my experience, I could feel the very strong desire of the local people in different states calling for closer relationship and cooperation.
China says the challenges may again put its wisdom to the test.
If we had TPP and we had some kind of path for China's accession, that would give China a way to kind of complete the reform and opening that President Xi talks about.
That's very important because that's the reason why China, carry out the free trade zone pilots, and so different companies will, really benefit from the dynamic economic growth in China.
As China's elites gather in Beijing, we look at what it will take to achieve a triple win. A trade agreement that benefits not only China and the U.S., but also the whole world. This week, follow China's campaign for freer international trade to be closer to China. China's two sessions, or Lianghui, the annual meetings of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, CPPCC, the top political advisory body, and the National People's Congress, NPC, the top legislature, commence on March 3rd and 5th, respectively. There is a formidable domestic agenda, including President Xi Jinping's call for preventing and diffusing major risks. Political risks, economic risks, social risks, the risks go on. Today, China-U.S. frictions commented importune time for China, when the country's annual GDP growth rate seems headed for its slowest in decades. China-U.S. rivalry, many now believe, has become far broader and more entrenched, including geopolitical competition, science and technology competition, differing views on sensitive issues. Must it be so? Can China and the U.S. find common ground, shared interests, so that both countries and the world can prosper? More broadly, how should China's diplomacy respond to international conditions? I address these questions from New York and from Beijing, watching how China-U.S. relations affects the globe takes us closer to China. Recently, I attended an event at the Chinese Consulate General in New York, marking the 40th anniversary of the establishment of China-U.S. diplomatic ties. I spoke with diplomats, economists, bankers, and investors on both sides. How do you see the U.S.-China trade war? What are the characterizations of a solution?
I think that we need to recognize no one wins in a trade war. Trade is a win-win for both countries.
Right, that's economics 101.
My only hope is that economic rationality will prevail.
Well, if we want economic rationality to prevail, I think we have to work hard at that, because that's not something that economists would like that, but behavioral economics is sometimes more important than rational economics. How do we deal with the behavioral economics? I mean, what are some of the ways to get real agreement?
I think that information is very important to the people knows the facts and the people to understand the cost. And fundamentally, people like to have a better life, and a company like to have
profits.
profitable opportunities, right? So as long as we know that, I think there's a will, there's a way.
We can see that while Sino-U.S. relations are tense, America's economic relations are also tense with other countries. Amid these tensions, trade, investment, and economic relations continue. This is one of the biggest problems for our economic operation, which we call changeable and worrisome.
There is a large community of Americans who have always been pro-China in the sense of wanting to build together, and some of them have become discouraged and now seek a new kind of strategic orientation that the U.S. has to take. Yeah. So it's those people who have genuinely been pro-China in their histories who have changed their views, or at least modified their views, that I'd be concerned about.
I also heard about the concern. Some of them worry about this, relationship, where we need to go. And what I want to say is we thank them for all they have done in promoting this good relationship, and history would prove what they've been doing are right. They're doing the right thing at this crucial time or special moment. So I should say to the American community, be confident. We also care about all those issues of your concern. Number two, be patient. China, when people to see China, you need to bear in mind the 1.4 billion people. It's a big country. No matter how big the cake is, if you cut it into 1.4 billion, each one could have a very small one. But in terms of the problem, no matter how small it could be, if you time it with 1.4 billion people, it could be a huge, gigantic one. So when you are dealing with China, you have to bear this in mind. So be patient. The market is still there. So confidence and the patience are very important, but action speaks louder. So I also want to say we need the determination to go ahead, continue this cooperation and friendship with China rather than decoupling. So this is a trend. We need to work together with this confidence, patience, and determination. I think we can revive our cooperation.
How important is the U.S. trade war or the trade tensions between the countries to China's economy? You hear a lot of different views. Some people think it really doesn't affect it that much.
I think by far the impact to the real economy has been quite limited. I talked with exporters. They say, 10%, we can handle that. Right? Some of them actually can negotiate the prices with American importers. Right? So let's increase the price a little bit. So in the U.S., you can feel that. Right? Some of the consumer goods have a little bit higher prices. Right?
And the RMB has depreciated since the beginning of the trade war time. So in RMB terms, it's not much of a change.
Exactly. Yeah, because of the depreciation, so it's just balanced off.
Right.
Right. But if the two countries failed to reach an agreement, then I think that would have a huge effect, a much larger effect on the Chinese economy. That's not going to help China. That's not going to help the United States either, right? Because the U.S. importers have to find alternative sources of imports, and that's going to beat up prices.
Last year, the China-U.S. trade war hit our stock market the hardest, which was unexpected since the Chinese economy had maintained the fastest growth rate among all the major powers. China hadn't confronted any major problems until then, so why did its stock market dive to the bottom of the world out of the blue? It was due to the expectations placed on China-U.S. trade. People were concerned that the world's two largest economies and trading nations might engage in a full-scale trade war. Some sold off, some fled, and others made plans to exit. We're optimistic about brighter prospects in 2019. For example, the two countries are back at the negotiating table, following up on two earlier rounds of negotiations. Going forward, we'll have more negotiations. Such arrangements indicate that a full-scale trade war can still be averted.
Unless the United States learns to play geoeconomic game more than geopolitical game.
Explain that.
In other words, today, under Mr. Trump, the United States is still playing largely a geopolitical game. So that means geopolitics is a zero-sum game. Therefore, there's conflict. But if the United States would change its perspective and consider its relations with the Chinese more geoeconomic, then probably there will be a lot more room for cooperation.
The way the world works is that the major powers should and must take responsibility for ensuring the peace and prosperity of the planet. According to the World Bank, China and the U.S. accounted for over 40% of the global GDP in 2017. The United States is the world's largest economy with its GDP of almost 20 trillion U.S. dollars. China is the second largest with its GDP of over 12 trillion U.S. dollars. In the current sensitive and complex international environment, President Xi and President Trump rightly represent their own peoples, but each should recognize, as they do, their global responsibilities. Global stability, growth, and standards of living are depending on China and the U.S. to seek and maintain good relations. So what can you do in your capacity in New York, where many of these corporations have headquarters and CEOs? What are the kinds of areas? We're not going to solve all problems here, obviously. But what are the kinds of approaches that China should take to the American business community and look for the win-win cooperation?
China's development will not stop. That's a market of 1.4 billion people. And we've been doing very well. The economy of China has been doing well. So China's development, future development, I think it's certain. While we are developing ourselves, we are providing or creating chances, opportunities for people on the other parts of the world, including America, especially in business area.
It's going to become another American market, basically. I believe after reforms, particularly after this, if China and the United States were to reach an agreement, China will become a much more open market to international companies and also exports from the United States or from Europe.
So the cooperation between U.S. and China is a potentially critical factor in China's development.
Exactly. I think those two countries are the two largest economies, right? So if those two countries can come together, then the whole world is going to benefit, no doubt about it.
I always say that two countries in the world are too big to fail, namely China and the U.S. With GDP of $13.7 trillion and $20 trillion, respectively, each accounts for 16% and 24.3% of the global economy. Combined, they constitute 40% of the global economy. At one point during 2018, China alone was contributing half of all global growth. Such a huge economic powerhouse must accept its global obligations accordingly. That's one key reason why President Xi and President Trump need to sit down and talk. We both bear these historic responsibilities.
Our relationship has gone a lot beyond this bilateral dimension. We have been working together to deal with, to address this international issues challenging the whole world, like the terrorism and many other issues, of course. And also we've been working together to address this regional sports like the Korea Peninsula, like Iran, like Afghanistan, like to deal with the ivory trading, to control of the use of fentanyl, and many others. So I think we've been working together to maintain the world peace and the stability and the prosperity.
So everything is possible. And that's how China was able to move so fast. And besides, I think this has to do with Chinese culture too. You know, in the West, starting from Socrates, the belief is you cannot make two opposites work. And this is very deeply rooted in Western culture. But the Chinese yin-yang school says you can make opposites work. Because there's in yin, there's yang, in yang, there's yin, and the two may appear to be opposite to each other, but the two can be made to work together, so that 1 + 1 is bigger than 2. That's how the Chinese economy has been moving so fast, and by now China is not only number 2, but many people say pretty soon it's going to be number 1.
Though it now faces downward pressure, China's economy is still growing at a comparably high growth rate. In fact, the supply-side structural reform that we're talking about, the so-called 5 major tasks of cutting industrial capacity, destocking, deleveraging, lowering costs, and improving weak links, are nearly all aimed at a D, or reducing something. Therefore, there's the problem of economic downturn.
At this 2019 two sessions, there is a complex agenda of formidable domestic risks and complex international tensions. President Xi has bluntly called on Chinese officials to prevent and diffuse major risks, political and ideological risks, economic risks, especially financial risks, science and technology risks, social risks, overseas risks, and party risks. Moreover, China is still fighting the 3 major battles, which President Xi stressed after the 19th Party Congress in late 2017. The consistent themes of reducing risk, reducing pollution, and ending extreme poverty. On the international front, at this crucial moment, I spoke with 2 American experts about the main challenges China faces and their possible resolutions. Robert Hormats, former Undersecretary of State, an international diplomat and financial leader, and Steve Orlins, the longtime president of the National Committee. What is it over the last few years that so many of your colleagues in Washington, guys that I've known, women that I've known, who for their entire careers were so-called pro-China, who were supportive of good relations, turning in recent years to say, either we failed or we have to have a new approach because China is not going to be a partner, China is going to be a competitor at best?
Well, I think China will compete on economic matters just like we compete with Canada, we compete with China, we compete with Britain, we compete with Germany. I think the important thing is to make a distinction between normal economic competition and confrontational competition. And that, to me, is where I think people don't fully understand. China is now a technological power. It's an AI superpower. There is going to be more of the traditional competition that countries and companies normally have with one another. The important thing that I think a lot of people miss is that we can compete effectively and constructively if we have a framework for doing it. And I think what's happened now is that China's rise has been such a surprise to so many Americans. They never dreamt that they would see a China which they had thought of as producing labor-intensive products, now producing AI, now producing quantum computing, now producing autonomous vehicles. I was at the Shenzhen Fair. Enormous quality innovation in China, and they're going to be selling it around the world as IBM and Cisco Systems and Google, they all try to do the same thing.
So if we trace the history of this, starting a good starting point is 2001 when China joined the WTO. Some of the policies then, in terms of what China was allowed to do under WTO rules, because it was a developing country, was entirely appropriate then. And some of the activities that China might have done in terms of cyber or intellectual property and not paying as much attention to it, China says that we're not doing anything different. Suddenly the U.S. is attacking us. U.S. says...
Well, China has said they were going to reform. Or if you look at the original WTO accession and kind of what we thought was going to go on, the first 5 years, so from 2001 to 2006, actually the reforms were pretty good. That if you look at like the USTR report on China's WTO accession, they say 2001 to 2006, it pretty much met the benchmarks. Then in 2006 to 2011, it didn't meet the benchmarks. Now, since 2012, one could argue there's been backsliding. So this has caused unhappiness in the business community. What we often say is the business community is the ballast of U.S.-China relations. And that ballast has been deeply impacted by China's failure to reform.
So if you're advising both sides, and my advice to both sides would be to listen to you, what would you tell each side?
Well, on the economic side, I think the answers are, I think the economic side is actually not that difficult. I think the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress laid out a series of reforms that if implemented, if really implemented, I would say it's like 5% implemented. So you got another 95% to go. If those were really implemented, a lot of these structural issues in the U.S.-China trade and investment relationship would go away. So that's number one. For the United States, I would say recreate the TPP. That the Trans-Pacific Partner sets a bright, shining example of what we want from trade investment partners throughout the world.
And ideally, China would ultimately join.
Absolutely. You're completely right. So what would happen is China would see this, and they would then have kind of a beacon where they should be going. And it's kind of what Zhu Rongji did with WTO accession, is with the WTO accession in those first few years, we knew what the plan would be and that it would be implemented. If we had TPP and we had some kind of path for China's accession, that would give China a way to kind of complete the reform and opening that President Xi talks about. On the strategic side, I think the United States needs to get off this idea that China is a strategic competitor. Well, it is damaging to the United States. It's damaging to China. It strengthens those constituencies within the U.S. and within China that seeks to make the other confrontational, that seeks a confrontational relationship.
I think the debate in the United States has gone off track is the understanding that we have had issues with China in the past. We've resolved them. We have to demonstrate that we want to work with China to resolve issues and not engage in confrontation with China in the hopes that we can push them to do things that we want them to do without their feeling they have a vested interest in working with us to do them.
The world is undergoing great transformation, and so is China. Transformation is part of this new era, which is characterized by the shift of China's economy from high growth to high quality development. Meanwhile, the global environment faces tremendous changes. International economic and trade relations are obviously tense. This tension has directly affected China's external environment as well. As a result, and as our Central Economic Work Conference pointed out, we see worrisome changes and developments in our economy. This is something that in the past we'd never say aloud. Instead, we only said it was functioning well, and the trends were positive. So what's the worrisome issue today? It's the current external environment.
As Justin Lin Fu, member of the Standing Committee of the 13th CPPCC National Committee, told me, the main drivers of growth in China will be to stabilize leverage and to employ prudent yet flexible monetary policy, which means increasing money supply and facilitating credit availability to the private sector to support their investment. So if we go back 2 or 3 years, the primary economic driver was supply-side structural reform, dealing with overcapacity, deleveraging. President Xi Jinping talked about his 3 big battles for 2017 after the 19th Party Congress, and the first one was reducing risk, and financial risk was the major component of that. Also anti-pollution, anti-poverty, but let's focus on the risk. And so that was the focus. But then with more of a slowing down in the economy, maybe exacerbated by the trade war with the U.S., now there's a concern about if you deleverage too much, you're going to affect the economy at a time when the economy is weakening. So how do you deal with that tension?
So very true. So the policy need to be contingent. In the past 2-3 years, as you mentioned, to mitigate or to avoid the systematic risk, and especially in the financial sectors, was the main target. And now with the deleveraging has reached its goal, especially in the state-owned sectors. And so the government's policies will shift a little bit. Now change it to stabilize the leverage, and that will give the room for the monetary policy and to increase money supply, and also the credit availability to the private sectors. And that can support their investment, their industrial upgrading, and also will be a main driver of growth in China.
At this year's 2 sessions, we see a heavy agenda of pressing domestic needs. Yet the trade war is a real and present risk, not just to China and the U.S., but to world economic growth. The good news is that both presidents need a deal, though for different reasons. Put simply, President Xi is fighting to mitigate risks. President Trump is planning an election fight. A protracted trade war would disrupt their respective economies, undermining their respective fights. Moreover, there are multiple international tensions: Middle East, Brexit in the Eurozone, South Asia, East Asia, Russia. China is not immune from these. China calls for building a global community with a shared future for all humanity through win-win cooperation. The big picture is that U.S.-China agreement would be win-win-win, triple win. Win for China, win for the U.S., win for the peace and prosperity of the world. So, China must face a two-front battle: domestically preventing and diffusing major risks, plus continuing the fight against poverty and pollution, and internationally generating mutual benefits through open international trade and investment. There is synergy here. China's domestic and international challenges provide opportunity to reinforce each other. Such interdependence is a core feature of China's new era. That's why, at the 2 sessions, while I'm focused on the risks, I would also like to explore what it would take to reestablish a real partnership between the U.S. and China, which would greatly benefit the global community. Though beyond the scope of this episode, it's on our agenda for Closer to China.